Hey, good morning. It's Patricia Murphy. It's Wednesday. This is Seattle Now. The Duwamish tribe has been fighting for federal recognition for 40 years. Last week, they filed a lawsuit in U.S. District Court to plead their case. The recognition would mean access to support for education and health care. We'll hear more about the lawsuit from the tribe's attorneys in a minute, but first, let's get you caught up. The King County Council voted to create a cannabis safety task force. The stores have a lot of cash and are frequent targets for armed robberies. The measure passed by the council yesterday brings the sheriff and prosecutor's offices together with cannabis retailers and community members to determine how to protect retailers and customers. The task force will also examine where nearly $5 million in tax revenue is being spent. That was funding that was cut from the sheriff's office during the latest budget cycle. Seattle and King County says it will close its Tukwila, Federal Way, and Auburn COVID-19 testing sites by June 1st, some even sooner. That's a good reminder to get in on the latest round of free COVID tests from the feds. Each household can order up to 8 tests at covidtests.gov. And testing before you hang out together is an easy way to stop the spread of COVID. And Seattle Parks and Recreation says Alki Beach and Golden Gardens will close at 10 p.m. for the summer, starting May 27th. The usual closing time is 11:30, but King 5 reports that the reduced hours are an attempt to stop dangerous and illegal behavior. Parks and Rec says they'll start hustling people out starting at 9:30. Regular closing hours will return in September. There are 29 federally recognized Indian tribes in the state of Washington, and late last week, the Duwamish tribe filed a lawsuit in the U.S. District Court to join their ranks. The Duwamish have been working for more than 40 years to get the federal government to recognize them. The status would allow the Duwamish to access the benefits granted to federally recognized tribes, like funding and support for education, healthcare, and human services. James Rasmussen is a Duwamish Tribal Council member and Duwamish River Community Coalition Superfund manager. He spoke at a press conference last week at the Duwamish Longhouse and Cultural Center in West Seattle.
Since my grandfather's time, the Constitution that they put together was for the health and the welfare of Duwamish people. And that means the government, when we signed that treaty, was supposed to take care of health, welfare, and education. Those are the reason that we are looking for being recognized. That's it.
Attorneys Bart Freedman and Ben Mayer are with the firm K&L Gates and serve as legal counsel for the tribe. Bart, Ben, thanks a lot. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, we're happy to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you for having us.
Ben, let's start with you. There's no dispute that the Duwamish are indigenous to this region, just like the Suquamish, Muckleshoot, Tulalip, and Snoqualmie. Why then, for more than 40 years, has the federal government rejected the tribe's request for recognition?
Yes. So it all essentially boils down to treaty times. The government signed a treaty with the Duwamish tribe and has, not just for the last 40 years, but since 1855, failed to live up to that promise. The last 40 years have boiled down to a regulatory process that the department has unfairly and improperly applied against the Duwamish, and it's treated the Duwamish differently in that regulatory process. There are a host of reasons, but they've treated the Duwamish differently because it's a matrilineal tribe, and they've also failed to give the Duwamish an on-the-record hearing.
Can you define what you mean when you say a matrilineal tribe? I think that's important.
Sure, of course. Even the department recognizes that 99% of the Duwamish today descend from the historic treaty tribes from 1855. The majority of those members are made up of Duwamish women who, in the late 1800s and 1900s, refused to go to remote reservations. Instead, they chose to remain on their indigenous ancestral lands in and around the city of Seattle. And in that time period, the department and government also had a policy of unfairly and incorrectly determining that when a Duwamish woman married a non-Indian man, that woman relinquished her tribal ancestry and membership. That policy has never been applied to Indian men. And so when I say matrilineal tribe, I mean the Duwamish continues to descend from the Duwamish women who remained in the ancestral territory of the Duwamish tribe.
I just want to add a little bit to what Ben said. The Duwamish really were at ground zero for the impact of civilization, the settlement by Western settlers, right? I mean, when you think about these kind of bureaucratic regulations that the department has created to try to evaluate these, an example is, are you living together at the place where you historically lived? And they say no. There were laws that said if you're a Native American, you can't live in Seattle. When the federal government created the locks, they literally drained the water from the Black River, which was the location of the last Duwamish village. So it's kind of absurd in a sense for the department to say, we, including the explicit actions of the federal government, have made it impossible for you to remain, and yet we're dinging you on these criteria for recognition because you don't have a village in the middle of Seattle.
So what I'm hearing you say, Bart, is the Duwamish were not necessarily free to stay in the city, and now this is being used against them ultimately by the federal government to prevent them from getting this tribal recognition. A lot of benefits come with this recognition, like funding for healthcare and education and human services, also protection of cultural resources and land. What would it mean for the tribe to be federally recognized? What would it mean for the 600 members of the Duwamish?
During the pandemic, many of federally recognized tribes were able to share immunizations and other things like that with their communities. The Duwamish didn't have any of those healthcare benefits, and tragically, members of that community died during it. So it's this community that has sort of survived against all odds in really kind of heroic ways, and both on a cultural level, a community level, the ability to enhance that sense of identity and not to be continually told, you don't exist, are just some examples, I think, of ways in which that recognition is so important.
Sure. It's been a long fight for this recognition from the Duwamish, and for the first time in history, a Native American is leading the Department of the Interior. Secretary Deb Haaland is a member of Pueblo of Laguna. What might this mean for the latest attempt?
Well, we don't know. We're a long way removed from the department, but obviously we would hope that the fact that the Duwamish are a tribe that is largely descended from a small group of Native American women, that it's been led by a resilient leader, Cecile Hansen, for 45 years. We would hope that would have some traction, but that's a conversation that we're not part of. But, the city of Seattle is such a progressive place. It's so aware of injustice, and yet we walk the streets that literally where the tribe was forced out of, as Ken Workman, a member of the Duwamish, says, in an absolute scientific sense, the DNA of the Duwamish people is in the trees of Seattle, and yet we don't recognize the profound injustice that this tribe that was just forced out, burned out, drained out of the city of Seattle doesn't have this basic criteria of recognition.
Ben, the federal government's refusal to recognize the Duwamish is supported by several tribes in the region. This is a very complicated issue. Who's been vocal about the pursuit for federal recognition? Who's against it, and why?
There have been various tribes. They're very clearly involved in the litigation, prior litigation, and that's the Muckleshoot and Tulalip. And I'm not going to speak on their behalf or say why they're opposed. In many ways, that's cultural. I would just say that the tribe has been very clear that this is not a fight with those tribes. They're brothers and sisters, and they want this to be a collective uplifting for everyone and not having continual fights against other tribes.
Okay, sure. And let's note here the Muckleshoots have been very public about their position. They claim the vast majority of Duwamish descendants are members of other tribes, including the Muckleshoot, Puyallup, Tulalip, Suquamish, and Lummi tribes. And the Muckleshoot point to a 1970 U.S. Supreme Court decision to recognize their tribe as political successor to the Duwamish. And the tribe has also taken out radio underwriting on KUOW to voice its opinion about the Duwamish tribe. Full disclosure. I'm curious what you see as the possible outcomes for this case and when you expect a ruling.
Sure. Well, it's easy to overlook the fact that the Duwamish actually are recognized by the United States and have been continuously. And so if there's one core thing we want to prove here, it's that, in fact, we think we're entitled to recognition right now. And the reason is this. In 1855, as we all know, the Treaty of Point Elliott was negotiated. In 1859, the Congress of the United States ratified that treaty. That is a government-to-government agreement between the Duwamish and the United States. And the case law and statutes are super clear that when Congress acts to recognize a tribe, the Department of Interior does not have authority to overturn that. The only party that can terminate that action is Congress. We're going to ask the court to recognize that. We're hoping for a positive result, and we're hoping for one sooner rather than later.
Bart, Freedman, and Ben Mayer are with Seattle law firm K&L Gates and serve as the legal counsel for the Duwamish tribe. Really appreciate your time. Thank you for hashing this out with us.
You're welcome. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Jenny Cecil Moore produced today's show with help from Diana Opong and Brandy Fullwood. Matt Jorgensen does our theme music. I'm Patricia Murphy. See you tomorrow.